Welcome everyone to our Community and Conversation event number 2. This is a virtual event series hosted by the Hamilton-Wenham Human Rights Coalition. I am the president of the coalition, and I'm joined today by Dr. Joan DeGeorge, who is another board member and a Wenham resident, who is going to share her expertise with us about having hard conversations around the dinner table. I'm sure all of us have had these conversations with friends or siblings or parents or relatives where you want to love each other, but you end up having really difficult conversations, and it doesn't always end well. So Joan is an incredible speaker and has a huge knowledge base. So she has offered her time today to help us develop better, more effective strategies for having those hard conversations. So we're very grateful to her. I'll introduce her a little bit more in a moment. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that we all live on Indigenous land. The Hamilton-Wenham Human Rights Coalition acknowledges the Massachusetts tribe, the tribe of Indigenous peoples from whom the colony, province, and Commonwealth of Massachusetts have taken their name. We pay our respect to the ancestral bloodline of the Massachusetts tribe and their descendants who still inhabit historical Massachusetts tribe territories to this day. Next, it is my great privilege to formally introduce Dr. Joan DeGeorge. She holds a clinical PhD in psychology from UMass Amherst and currently teaches psychology at Harvard and at Endicott, is a published researcher with an emphasis on empathy as a therapeutic tool. She is a resident of Wenham. She is local to our coalition. She is also the founding clerk of our board of directors. She's a huge supporter of the group and a wonderful speaker and very intelligent, and we're very lucky to have her here. So I'm going to stop my screen share and let Joan take it away.
Sorry, everyone, let me just give it just a second to get my screen share going. All right, can everyone see my my slides?
Yes.
All right. Great, I see some nods. Thank you all for being here today. I know Saturday time is precious. I'm hoping it's going to be worth your while. Thank you, Anna, for the introduction. I'm going to talk about just what Anna said today. When there's people in our lives that we care about, maybe it's our loved ones, friends, neighbors, who sometimes say some really awful things and or things that really don't sit well with us, things that we know are wrong one way or another. What do we do about that? And I think as left-leaning folks, progressive folks, we have a real interest in logic and the facts, and we tend to argue using those tools, assuming that if we just say the right thing or just give them the right piece of evidence, that they'll pick it up and say, oh, you know what, you are right. I will abandon these conspiracy theories or these notions that are really not so helpful. But I'm going to talk today a little bit more about being effective, which sometimes means letting go of being right, which for me is a hard thing to let go of, but I'm going to try to make the point that it's worthwhile. Okay, so who is this talk for? I just want to take a moment to be clear that I'm talking to today people that have some position of power, some position of privilege. It might be men, it might be people who are white, who are straight, who are cisgendered, who are financially comfortable. We have some power to educate people because we aren't sort of emotionally stretched by having folks aggress against us every day. And I know many of us can acknowledge the privilege that we have, but we don't always know what to do with it beyond sort of owning it. This talk is a little bit for folks who want to know how they can do the work. It's not for folks who are in a vulnerable position. I don't want anyone to walk away from this talk and turn to someone who's an ethnic minority or turn to someone who's a sexual minority and say, if you were just calmer, your conversations would go a lot better. When folks are in a vulnerable position, they are allowed to do whatever they need to do in response to aggressive statements or actions. For us, though, when we have power or privilege, let's use that because we might not be as emotionally stretched. So When we're faced with someone saying something not so great, we're often pulled to sort of shout them down, to sort of go on the attack, to maybe call them out. And I understand that this might not be the wrong thing to do. A lot of times we might say, yeah, that person really does need to be called out, but it might not be the effective thing to do. And I'm going to tell us a little bit about why. So calling someone out usually doesn't work. It makes us feel better, but it makes no impact on that other person's thoughts or behaviors. It also creates shame, and shame backfires if our ultimate goal is to get people to move a little bit more progressively or to take action that's maybe a little bit more societally beneficial. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about shame. And finally, not only does it not work and create shame, it also backfires. It also might make things worse than when we started that conversation. So not only have we not gotten that person to move closer to us, we might have gotten them more entrenched with the views that they started this conversation with. So I'm going to talk more about that on the next several slides. Oops, there we go. So why is shame in particular such a bad thing? You might be thinking that person should feel shame. They just said something awful. And I agree with you that it might not be wrong for them to feel shameful, but trying to induce that state is almost always going to backfire. We feel guilt when we feel bad about a behavior that we've done, and that usually gets self-generated. But we tend to feel shame when someone has attacked us. Shame is about feeling bad about who we are. And the human brain will go to great lengths to protect itself from that feeling of shame. People are biologically wired actually to avoid this feeling. You want to protect a sense that you're a decent person, that you're not a terrible person. So I'd like you to think about a time that maybe you felt shame or somebody shamed you. And imagine what your immediate reaction was. You know, it may have been to run away from the problem, to push it out of your mind entirely. I'd like to bring an example in that's not politically relevant, but happened at home. So last year, my oldest son was in kindergarten, and it was hybrid school and hybrid work, and every day was a different schedule. And I share this example with my husband's permission, but one day it was my husband's job to pick my kindergartner up from school, and he forgot. And he didn't seem all that guilty about it. So my feeling was, why don't you feel more guilty? I kind of read him the riot act saying, can you imagine what he felt like sitting there while all the other kids got picked up? It's such an awful feeling, hoping that I could sort of make my husband feel guilty so that this wouldn't happen again. But guess what happened? All that shaming that I did made my husband shut down from, problem solving. And it wasn't 2 weeks later that my kindergartner did not get picked up again when it was my husband's turn. So when we shame people, it makes them shut down. They don't actually hear what's happening. And if you remember a time you felt shame, you might remember something similar. And again, this is because we're actually physiologically wired not to feel this way. So I'm going to geek out a little bit here, so a little bit of biology. So we kind of have two systems in our nervous system that are kind of polar opposites of one another. And one is the parasympathetic system, which is really important for us to be in most of the time. It's when our body engages in things like digestion and healing, maintenance, keeping our immune system running. It's a really nice place to be. But when we face a threat, like running from a bear or an angry guy on the highway that's trying to cut us off, hydroplaning while we're driving, our body jumps out of that maintenance mode and into what we call the fight or flight system, or the sympathetic nervous system. And when we're in this system, everything else stops. All maintenance stops. Digestion stops. Our body is just in survival mode. Our heart beats faster. Our breathing rate increases because all our system cares about at that moment is surviving. Now, this makes sense if we're facing, a bear or, something that's trying to physically harm us. But in fact, our brain responds to threatening information and challenges to our belief system in the same way that we would react to a predator. So our brains are actually pretty similar to the way they were in the Stone Age. We're sort of Stone Age brains. And because we're not facing down tigers and bears anymore, our brains take those, comments or what we might perceive as an attack or things that are making us feel shamed and turns on that fight or flight mode. Now, if you think of a time that you were, feeling panicked, like, your car brakes weren't working or you were hydroplaning or, you were feeling really scared, think about how nuanced your thinking was at that time. Were you considering situations thoughtfully and focusing on small details, or were you just focused on getting away from that threat? That's how our brains work in fight or flight. So when we make people feel shamed, and when we challenge strong political beliefs, actually, MRI studies have found that when people have strong political beliefs that are challenged, again, that fight or flight system turns on. So that's something we absolutely want to avoid when we're arguing or debating with people on political issues, because we don't want to flip them out of maintenance mode. Maintenance mode is where they actually might hear us and we might have an impact. So why is this important at all? Why can't we just say, well, if they feel shame, they feel shame, not my problem? I would argue it is a little bit of our problem. So in May of 2020, George Floyd was murdered, and the Black Lives Matter movement that had been around for quite some time became mainstream. People in white communities started to embrace it, put signs out on their lawn, join vigils. And by early June of 2020, 54% of Republicans said that discrimination was a problem in our country. This is the highest number it ever reached for that group. But by the end of late June, it was down to 40%, and it's decreased quite a bit since then. In 2021, a year after the Black Lives Matter protests became mainstream, only 17% of Americans said that they believed race relations were better than they were a year ago. And this was after a renewed energy to combat discrimination, hate in schools, government, law enforcement, healthcare, our own homes. And yet, after a year of all of that effort, only 17% of Americans felt like race relationships were better. And as of today, looking back over the last 2 years, police killings of civilians have not decreased. And this, to me, is a really concerning statistic, because it seems like the lowest hanging fruit in the sort of policy changes that could be made since George Floyd's murder. We also know that after George Floyd's murder, many folks in the country, regardless of political affiliation, agreed that white privilege was a thing. So Democrats had a boost up from the previous year, as did Republicans and Americans overall. But then a year later, in 2021, we actually found that that number decreased. And for Republicans, it went down lower than it had since 2018. So I would argue that all of those interventions we did may have been too heavy-handed or may have been shame-inducing in some instances, which caused folks that may have been open to changing their views, changing their attitudes. We lost them a little bit along the way. Another statistic from the last few years found that in June 2020, when we had that 54% of Republicans agreeing that white privilege might be a thing, trust in law enforcement and trust in Black Lives Matter was about equivalent. But then a year ago, in March of 2021, there's now a 19-point gap between trust in law enforcement and trust in Black Lives Matter. I'm not saying increase in law enforcement trust is necessarily a bad thing, but it doesn't seem great that people have dramatically reduced their trust in Black Lives Matter. And we've seen the introduction of bans on teaching about race and slavery in school, the increase of book banning on human rights topics, banning of trans athletes at the high school level, an increase in the number of violent attacks against Asian Americans and Jewish Americans in this country. So we can do better than we're doing now. Of course, all of these issues are complex and have multiple societal influences as to why things aren't so great. There's a lot of evidence that some things have gotten worse. And I'm willing to bet that we have lost some folks who may have been open to hearing about change, especially on social issues, because of heavy-handed tactics. 2021 was evaluated as the worst year in recent history for LGBTQ state legislative attacks. 164% increase in the first quarter of 2021 for Asian American attacks in 16 of America's largest cities. And recently, a survey found that 1 in 3 men thinks feminism hurts women. So when we attack, we've chosen the wrong tactics, not because people deserve not to be shamed, because some of these things might actually backfire and hurt the causes that we care so deeply about. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you, no shaming. So what if you just read up on all of the great research that's out there and come prepared to calmly debate with all of those wonderful facts that you have? I love this idea. This is my wheelhouse. This is where I go to. Yet facts are no longer unbiased data points. We assume if we have all of this evidence, people will hear it and it will click. But that's assuming that facts are these standalone beacons that aren't influenced by a ton of other weighty things. In fact, facts are now badges of identity. They identify you as a member of a group. They're not so much related to, what scientists say or what the newspaper says, but it's about belonging. If you believe a certain fact, that allows you loyalty to a group, that allows you membership to a group. And that's not a small thing. Identities signify belonging and acceptance in a community. You don't have to necessarily explain yourself when you're in a community. You're sort of accepted as a member. It gives you a sense of who you are. And so when someone is trying to correct a fact that you have shared or that you believe in, it's not just a matter of 1 + 1 = 2. It's a matter of you saying, I don't think your identity is correct. Of course, there are many identities that we would say, yeah, that's incorrect. But you can imagine that the threat level that goes up when someone hears that is much higher than someone correcting a math mistake. I'd love for you to think about an identity that is important to you: progressive, feminist, environmentalist, a caring son, any of those things. And if someone told you that that identity was wrong and that you should change it, even if you could come around to believing that's the case, it's going to be very difficult. It's not going to happen in one conversation, but in most cases, it's probably going to make you very angry. So when we challenge facts, we think we're dealing with, the hard evidence in front of us, but in fact, we're challenging the other person's identity. Now, you might be thinking, oh, geez, why are folks who are a little bit more conservative or less progressive so bound to their identities and not facts? I would like to take a few minutes to point out that they're not the only ones. Now, all groups are susceptible to this idea of tribalism, where your group membership is just so critical to your sense of self. Now, there's a lot of evidence that progressive folks, left-leaning folks are more trusting of science, but we're not immune to trusting our beliefs over facts. So one area where progressives and left-leaning folks are a little bit immune to facts are, the example here is GMO foods. GMO foods are safe. There's overwhelming scientific evidence. And in case you're not familiar with it, GMOs are genetically modified organisms. It's where genetic material has been altered in a way that doesn't naturally occur. And you can't buy a product at Whole Foods now without a non-GMO label. There are many progressive organizations that try to get GMOs taken out of foods or to increase labeling. But in fact, the evidence that GMOs are safe are as robust as the evidence that climate change exists and is caused by humans. So when you see someone who's more conservative who says, I don't know if I believe in this climate change stuff, I don't know if it's caused by humans, and it's like, well, geez, there's so much evidence. Almost every, climate scientist out here agrees. The same is true for food science. And this is an area where more liberal-leaning folks are not so good and actually have caused harm. Folks from out of the country in the Philippines incited protesters to rip up fields of golden rice, which is a type of rice that's been genetically engineered to have high levels of vitamin A, which is really important because there's a vitamin A deficiency in a lot of the world's poor. So this is an area that liberals can have a little bit of a blind spot. Nuclear energy is safe and clean. 62% of Republicans support nuclear energy, but only 45% of Democrats, even though 70% of scientists actually support nuclear power. And not only is nuclear power as clean as wind and solar, the death rate associated with nuclear energy is also as low, and that's accounting for deaths at Fukushima and Chernobyl. Obviously, coal, oil, and natural gas, much higher death rates, much dirtier. And when we work to shut down or prevent nuclear energy, we make more deaths and we make less clean air. And yet, this is an area where the evidence is really clear. There's a lot of great logic, and liberal groups tend to push back against those facts. Finally, this one is not scientifically based, but Bill Clinton's sexual harassment, sexual assault history. Some photos of women here who had publicly addressed Clinton of sexual assault or misconduct during his either presidential campaign or his presidency, including Huniata Broderick there, who had accused Bill Clinton of rape in 1978 and then accused Hillary Clinton of intimidating her. Very few Democrats and progressive voters abandoned Clinton's candidacy when these allegations came to light, and he was still invited, most recently to the Democratic National Convention. He has not been banned from, liberal circles. And when Trump's Access Hollywood's tapes came out during his campaign, which were awful, I know a lot of friends who said, how could anyone support someone who spoke about women that way? And there are these other accusations against Trump related to sexual assault and sexual harassment. And yet these were the same folks who voted for Clinton when he had the same type of accusations out there. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is not to say that, liberals are bad and, we ignore the science. As I said, there's a lot of evidence that we trust the science more than folks who are anti-progressive. But if you felt sort of a feeling bubble up while I was talking about these, it's sort of, yeah, but, or Monsanto, or, Vermont Yankee, you had this feeling of like, wait, stop. I don't agree with this. This is bringing up emotions for me. That's great, because that's going to highlight for you the same kind of feelings that someone whose identity is threatened by these dinner table conversations might be feeling. So remember what that feeling is right now. If one of these things challenged you or it's going against one of your beliefs, this is the same kind of discomfort that makes people get ready to argue back and not really listen to what's happening. Another reason that, logic, this is my last sort of complaint against logic before we get into it, is that emotions can often override logic. So maybe you've seen these news stories come up recently, but this is the Euro spider, a 4-inch spider the size of a human palm, described as a Nerf football with legs. They've been found to have a metabolism twice as high as similar spiders and a heart rate that's 77% faster, which allows them to survive in cold climates. They'll be in New England in the next 5 to 10 years. There's already millions of them in southern states. They have this incredible ability to travel where they balloon their webs and almost fly. They are venomous and can spread very, very quickly. So I'm hoping that brought up some emotion for some folks. However, they're non-aggressive. They avoid humans. Their fangs are so fragile that they cannot penetrate human skin. And in fact, they might be beneficial to us, even though they're an invasive species, because they could eat other invasive species, such as stink bugs, that we have a problem with. Does anyone feel better about the spider now? Maybe some of you do, but many of you might be still saying, nope, if they get here, I am moving. I saw lots of comments when these newspaper articles that were coming out a few weeks ago, folks just writing, nope in big letters. So this I'm using to illustrate that just because we know the facts about something does not override a pre-existing emotional reaction we might have to certain ideas and certain issues. One other point I'd like to make about emotion is that emotion and our political affiliation actually have some overlap. Social scientists have known for a long time how to turn liberals into conservatives in the lab. All you have to do is scare them. There was research conducted at Yale when folks noticed that liberal-leaning folks actually had a strong conservative shift in the US after September 11th. In fact, liberals were suddenly much more likely to support George W. Bush and favored increase in military spending, which is not traditionally a liberal-leaning platform. And so they wanted to know why this big shift happened. And so what they did was bring people into the lab and make them think about something that they were scared of, making them think about death in some way. And this took people who tended to view social issues in a liberal lens and moved them a little bit more conservative, at least for a time. We also know that when you look at the brains of folks who self-identify as conservative, when we look at them in an MRI machine, they actually have larger and more active amygdalas. So amygdalas are these small almond-shaped structures that are deep in your brain that are responsible for the expression and processing of fear. Now, why would conservatives have structures in the brain responsible for fear that are bigger than liberals? It's hard to say. It could be that some folks are just born with a bigger amygdala. It could be that being exposed to a lot of fear-based media makes your amygdalas bigger. It's probably some sort of complex interaction between the two. But folks who might feel that there's a lot of perceived threat around them, it would make sense that they would turn to political conservatism because it reduces fear, anxiety, uncertainty. A lot of conservative viewpoints have a sort of black or white framework. There's not a lot of ambiguity. There's not a lot of push to change. And so if you're perceiving threat more often than your neighbor, then you're going to seek out a group that explains how the world is supposed to work, give you order, and then might justify any anxieties that you have about inequality. So not saying that lets folks off the hook, for believing certain things, but it does help us come to the table, come to the conversation with another tool in our toolbox to realize that this might be fear-driven or driven as a response to a perceived threat than it is about anger or a personality flaw. It could be that too. If you're curious in the reverse, there is a way to get conservatives to act more liberally on social issues. Haven't figured out a way related to economic issues, but on liberal issues. And that's to ask them to imagine that they're Superman. Folks in the lab who are asked to imagine that they were as invincible as Superman, that bullets could bounce off of them, fire wouldn't scorch their skin, a fall from a cliff wouldn't hurt them. They filled out measures on social issues as much more liberal than they did the week prior. So if you're going to have a dinner with folks, maybe a Thanksgiving dinner or a birthday dinner, with folks that you might get into it with politically, do a little dinner table exercise and ask everybody to imagine their favorite superhero or imagine their favorite superpower and what would they do with it. And that might put them in a little bit better of a state of mind to hear some liberal ideas. So when we debate somebody, even if we have fantastic information at our fingertips, there's a real risk of actually making things worse when we debate with somebody. So even if we, put aside the idea of beliefs being more powerful than logic, emotion being more powerful than logic, even if that's not true, there's some other risks to debating, folks. And one is called the backfire effect. And I have a frame up here from a cartoon by the Oatmeal that did an amazing visual sort of interpretation of this effect. But what it says is when we're arguing with somebody and that argument gets sort of virulent enough, it actually makes the person move a little further extreme in their argument than they had originally come to the conversation with. So for example, if somebody is not so keen on masks, not so keen on vaccines, not quite sure this virus, that COVID is really all that dangerous, and they get into a debate with you, instead of coming closer to your point of view that vaccines are safe and masks are safe and the virus is real, they might actually become less convinced of it. And this is because when we argue with somebody, we're letting them practice all their counter arguments. So when you say masks and vaccines are safe and protect people, they aren't listening to you. They're going through their Rolodex of counter arguments and pulling them out and practicing making that argument and making it stronger and getting better at it. It doesn't mean they have any chance of convincing you, but they're self-convincing, working on their own argument style or their own belief style, and making themselves more entrenched. Next time you have a heated debate with someone, say your spouse or your parent, ask them the next day or when you've cooled off, ask them what they remembered about the points that you made during that argument. And you might find that you're pretty surprised. When we argue with somebody, we don't remember all of the brilliant, thoughtful points that they made. We remember the one or two stupid things that they said, because we feel better when we filter out all their good points and only remember when they made some lousy ones. And this is true of political debates as well as sort of regular interpersonal arguments. We forget the most logical claims and only remember a mistake that somebody made or lack of evidence that they had. If you're debating with somebody about the legitimacy of the 2020 election and they say, voter fraud is rampant. And you say, no, voter fraud never happens. And they say, oh, never? No, it never happens. Well, I can tell you at least several documented cases that have been in popular, mainstream media, and you can't come up with one of those. That might have been a throwaway, not important point to your conversation, but that person leaves only remembering you couldn't even come up with one example of voter fraud, even though there are documented cases. So another reason that debating can backfire is that people don't hear your good points. They only remember your not so great ones. Okay, so you maybe are on board with me. Shaming, bad. Debating, bad. What in the heck are you supposed to do? Saying nothing's not a great option, because if you don't, that person's going to go out into the world and insult someone else or put the work onto someone else. And again, this talk is for folks that have the emotional bandwidth to do this because we have some power or privilege. So the first thing you're going to do is be prepared. So before you grab that coffee with a friend or have Thanksgiving with your aunt, or run over to your neighbor's house to have a conversation, and you suspect that there might be some comments that come up that are going to be agitating, get prepared, have a game plan. And the first part of that game plan is to have a goal. So changing minds takes time. If your goal is, I want them to agree with me and say that I am right, then you've already lost. This is true for any kind of argument, right? I have a 4-year-old. He thinks I know everything. He looks up to me. And if I tell him he's wrong, does he say, oh, thank you, mommy, and walk away? No. He goes, no, I'm not. This is true for all of us. We are never going to convince someone that we're right with one conversation, especially if they're really far away from us. So your goal cannot be, they will say I'm right. And no, we don't always necessarily consciously have that goal, but a lot of times our actions mirror that type of expectation that if I just say the right thing, then they'll agree with me. We could have the goal to make the other person feel bad about themselves, and we likely would succeed, but there's two negative drawbacks to that. The person might stop bringing those conversation topics up with us at all. Their viewpoint hasn't changed, but they've just decided that they don't want to talk to us about it. And this limits our ability to maybe get some good material in there that could help them change their minds. It also makes them turn to the kinds of sources that will confirm their viewpoint. Fox News or the internet, the kinds of things that, pat them on the shoulder and say, there, I know your friend made you feel bad, but we'll take you in. And so again, making people feel bad can really backfire. It's best to set small, achievable goals. It could be, I want this person to be able to hear what I'm saying and remember it the next day. I would like to be able to walk away from this conversation less frustrated than I typically am. And you can even, sort of talk about this with the person. Hey, I know we're meeting up for Dad's birthday dinner this week, and we usually get into some really heated debates. And I know I always walk away frustrated, and I imagine you do too. I would love to have a conversation where that doesn't happen. You just lay it out there. A great goal could be to have a next conversation, to have that person willing to talk with you about those same issues again, where you actually might have the chance to have some impact. So I don't know everyone's sort of eating preferences here. I'm a meat eater myself. I imagine some of you are as well, but I am sensitive to sort of animal welfare issues and the environmental impact of meat. But when, some vegan organizations, come out with things that are very heavy handed, holding up pictures of dead animals or telling me I'm a murderer because I had a hamburger, I am shutting down. I am suddenly not open to hearing that message because it's way too much in intensity for me. But if someone has a small achievable goal and asks me to give up meat on Mondays or to consider, non-dairy milk replacement options most of the week, that's the kind of thing that's going to get me to eventually maybe get to that place. But the heavy-handed stuff tends not to work, especially if the goal is you should be vegan today. Now, this is a model that if some of you are in mental health might be familiar with. I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but it's a stages of change model. Anytime that we have a belief or a behavior that might not be so great for us, we don't change overnight. It's actually a long 6-step process that's not always, directional, that takes us from not thinking about making a change at all to fully inhabiting that change. So this can apply to things like stopping smoking or being ready to seek out mental health treatment, but it can also be true for changing a deeply rooted belief. And again, as I said, I'm not going to go into all of these stages in great detail, but having a sense of where the person you're debating is on this scale can help influence what kind of tactics you might use. So, for example, pre-contemplation stages, when people aren't considering a change at all. They're totally in denial that their behavior could be problematic at all, and in fact, is very central to their identity. You might approach that person very differently than if you were talking to someone who is more in the preparation stage. A preparation stage person is someone who's willing to make small changes, but not bigger ones, but might also be really vulnerable to setbacks or very vulnerable to criticism. And that might make them, kind of pull back a little bit. So thinking about where the other person is can kind of help direct what to do next. One general piece of advice I have is to praise small changes. We have a tendency when people aren't moving fast enough in the areas we'd like to see them change, we have a tendency to punish them for even making little bits of progress. So I'm going to throw my husband under the bus again here. After a 2010 incident where a wool sweater went into the dryer, he kind of washed his hands of the laundry. And at home, I'm pretty much the 100% on laundry and he's at 0%. I would love for it to be a 50-50 split in who does the laundry. So a few weeks ago, I came home and I heard the washer running. And I said, "Is that you? Did you just start a load of laundry?" And he said, "Yeah, I did." Now, this is great, right? This is a small change. It's not 50-50. It's not where I would like him to be, but it's fantastic. And what I should do is praise that progress, even if it's small, even if it's not 100% of what I want. Now, when he said, "Yeah, that was me," what do you think I said? I said, "Did you have a stroke?" Guess how many loads of laundry he's done since then. We have a tendency to punish progress when it's not as good as we think it should be. Another example, I'm not good at flossing my teeth, just don't like doing it. Went to a regular dentist appointment and I don't know, had a cavity or something. And I thought, you know what, I am going to start flossing. Found these little floss sticks and, did my bit every night. Went back 6 months later and I was so proud to report, "Guess what? I'm flossing." And the hygienist said, "What kind of floss are you using?" And I said, "Oh, these little sticks." She said, "Oh, that's not good. You don't want to use that kind." Guess what? I stopped flossing. I know, I should get back to it. But when we punish progress, it doesn't get people closer to where we want. It makes them fall back. So imagine if someone said, "Okay, I think COVID is real and I will get one of the vaccination shots, but I'm not going to get two. That's too much mRNA in my body," or whatever. You could say, "Well, that's ridiculous. You have to get all the shots." Or you could remember your goal and say, "I'm so glad that you've accepted that COVID's real. And I'm so glad that you're making some progress. This will open the door to the next conversation. I know it's not enough, but it's going to open the door to get you to that next place. Okay, so let's say you're in the debate. You're starting to argue, you're starting to talk, I should say. What are some strategies that you could use? Well, if you're the kind of person who gets nervous during these, if you're more of a flight person than a fight person, if you're the kind of person that just prefers to avoid these conversations, or you're really particularly concerned about getting emotional, one thing you can do is a process comment. This is sort of pulling the lens way back and not commenting on any of the content of the conversation, but on the style of the conversation. This really helps you become less emotional, and it's really good for using with people you're debating who pride themselves on their own logic. So, for example, and there are a lot of common logical fallacies that people use when they debate. Everybody does, and this is only 3 here. You could Google online common logical fallacies and find many others. But for example, if the person starts attacking you as a person and says, well, you just want to believe that because you want to feel like a good person, but you don't actually care about these people. Instead of saying, well, yes, I do. How dare you? That's getting into the content. You could pull back and say, I've noticed we've been talking about, this particular issue, but you just changed it up to talking about me as a person. And I think that really takes us away from the content of the argument. Why do you think you did that? It takes a step back. It helps you feel less emotional. It helps not put you on the defensive, and it brings the person back maybe to the content. Another common type of logical fallacy is a straw man argument, a non-political example here where someone sets up an overly simplified version of your argument. So one person says to their spouse, I'd rather get a dog instead of a cat. And their spouse says, why do you hate cats? So that's a straw man argument. Or you could say, I think we should ease up on the, deportations of people who arrived here illegally and make an easier path for them for citizenship. It just makes so much sense to me. And your, relative could say, oh, I guess we should just throw open the doors to everyone then and let in anybody who wants to come. And while we're at it, how about we throw them the keys to our house and hand them our job? Instead of saying, obviously, I didn't mean that, or that's never going to happen, you're going to start losing, things in that sort of defensiveness. You could say, well, I'm noticing that you're trying to take this argument to, an oversimplified version, or you're claiming a slippery slope argument, that there's this huge chain of events that's inevitable. Could you think of some other reasons why I might have said I would like, pathway to citizenship to be easier? You are focused on the content, or I'm sorry, you're focused on the construction of the argument, not the comments. This is really good for diffusing high emotional arguments. Be an anthropologist. This is another great tactic if you are someone who prefers generally to flee or not to have the conversation at all, or if things are getting really heated. So this is an opportunity to, pretend that you're Margaret Mead here. Put on your anthropologist hat. Imagine that you have a notebook. Sit back and view the situation dispassionately. Like, fascinating. Okay, this person really strongly believes that. I wonder why that might be. Oh, this emotion is coming out a lot when they talk about, the election. And it seems to be an area of great inflexibility. That's interesting. You're not saying that out loud to the person, but it's really good for us when we're worried about our own emotions becoming overwhelmed. And we just need to take a little space, mental space in the conversation. Maybe you don't want to walk away. Maybe you don't want to end the conversation, but you're listening and dispassionately observing it as though you were a scientist. And this helps, again, stay out of that defensive sort of back and forth. Very similar to be an anthropologist is to be curious. A famous quote from Hero to All, Ted Lasso. Be curious, not judgmental. I know this is a hard sell because a lot of times the things we're hearing are worthy of judgment and you can be inside judging them. But in the conversation, ask questions. Get at the root of why they are expressing a particular viewpoint and don't assume that you know why. So for example, someone might have a strong commitment to the Second Amendment and gun ownership, and you just assume it's because, Fox News told them to. but maybe they had a relative who was a victim of violent crime and having guns around makes them feel safer. We know it doesn't, and I know we know it actually makes them less safe. But if you go in with that immediately, you might miss out on figuring out where their beliefs are derived from and make them shut down, or avoid other avenues where you might have an outlet to talk to them. Play Colombo. So this is a therapeutic technique that we use with patients sometimes. And when I mention this to students, it's now no one knows who Colombo is anymore. 10 years ago, I had a few students with great luck. People know that Peter Falk was the grandfather in Princess Bride, but I assume I don't have to explain to everyone here who Colombo is, but he was a detective on a TV show that presented himself as sort of rumpled and inept, and he had a lot of sort of pestering behavior that annoyed criminals and let them think that he was stupid and they were smart. And he would ask all these little questions like, oh wait, but what time did you say you left work? Oh, okay, but I have notes here that said that wasn't the case with your boss. I'm really sorry. Can you help clear that up for me? It's not really playing stupid, but it's sort of a lot of small questions that sort of get to an I don't get it, explain it to me point that can help highlight for the person their own problematic thinking. So this actually came up for me when I was teaching a Psych 100 course, and I teach a lecture on problem solving, and I give the students a bunch of brain teasers. And one of the ones I give them is what's 3/7 chicken, 2/3 cat, and 1/2 goat? If you're curious, the answer is Chicago. But as the students were sort of puzzling these out, one student said to me, thankfully not to the rest of the class, he said, "Oh, Chinese food." And instead of saying, "That's not funny, that's a racist joke," I said, "I don't get it. What? That's not the answer." And he went, No, but Chinese food." I said, "No, I don't know why." He said, "Well, because all the icky stuff in Chinese food." I'm like, "Oh, I don't think Chinese food is icky. I love it. Don't you love it?" He said, "Yeah, no, I love it too. It's just, I mean, I guess." And he just, he heard the racism in it through my sort of gentle questioning, my sort of Columbo act. You could do this if somebody said to you, "Oh, immigrants are taking our jobs. We need to keep them out of this country." And you could play Columbo here. You could say, "Wait, oh, they're taking jobs? Everywhere in town here is looking to hire and they can't find anybody. And it's a lot of entry-level positions. How does that match up? Because I thought we were desperate for labor." It helps the person sometimes see the own error of their logic if you take this Columbo route. Find the feeling. So recall that fear or perceived threat could be at the core of a lot of anti-progressive views. And a chance to try to align with the feeling, not their beliefs, might open their ears a little bit more to hearing things that we might have to say. So for example, if someone says, "Oh, masks are terrible. They don't help with the virus. They're limiting our kids' social skills. They increase the amount of carbon dioxide that we're breathing, and that can't be good for our brain cells. I'm not sending my kid to school with a mask." I know now it's optional, but these are definitely debates I'm sure some of us had. You could dispute all of those facts, that lots of evidence have come out that there isn't a significant impact on social skills, that carbon dioxide, not poisoning us. However, if you want them to actually have a chance of hearing you, you could identify with the feeling that you're hearing there. What's the feeling in that statement? "Wow, you sound like you have a lot of concern for your kids' health and well-being. Can you tell me more about some of the fears you have for your kids?" Maybe they're having struggles with their kids in other areas. Maybe getting their kids to comply with mask wearing is such a big battle that they're overwhelmed by it. And this is just a reaction from someone that's feeling overwhelmed in general. So that might change your response to, "I hear you, that's a lot. And I'd be worried about the impacts on my kids given what everything you just described. And I have to disagree. I don't align with those claims about masks that you told me, but I'd love to chat more about all these feelings that you're experiencing." You don't have to be their therapist. You don't have to hold their hand. But if instead of counter arguing the facts, you find the feeling, you're going to open the door to them having any possibility of listening to you. I'm gonna be honest with you. This one's hard, but it's also one of the most powerful. Find a kernel of truth in what they're saying. Can you find anything, no matter how minuscule, to align with in what they're saying? It's really hard to argue with someone who's agreeing with you. It opens emotional doors. This is true of any argument. So, getting back to that mask argument, you could say, I'll be honest with you, all that mask guidance was super confusing. And I felt overwhelmed because at the very start, they told us not to wear masks at all. And then cloth masks were fine. Then we could take them off if we were vaccinated. But no, now we need to upgrade to N95. It was a lot. And I can understand why people had trouble trusting, health advice at that time. So I agree with you. It was a lot of confusing information. It's going to be hard to do this, especially if people are saying things in the vein of racism and, sexism and, every kind of ism out there. But if you can find some kernel of truth, something that allows you to agree with them somewhere, are, walls that we put up when we hear someone challenging us, challenging our beliefs, get lowered. And when somebody says, I agree with you, that was really hard, the chance that the next thing you're going to say is actually going to be heard goes up dramatically. And finally, appeal to their morality. This is similar to the way where agreeing with someone makes them more likely to listen to you. Giving them a compliment is going to make them listen to you. So you could say something like, I'm really surprised to hear you say that. When I think of you as someone who cares deeply for others, especially for children. This strong stance you have against trans athletes in high school is so inconsistent with the kind of caring person I view you to be. I want to talk more about that with you. You just gave them a bunch of compliments. So instead of countering them, what they've said with facts, you're opening the door for them to hear some of those facts now that you've complimented them. Or I know how thoughtful you are when you collect facts when it comes to making financial decisions for your family, and you're so careful about the sources of information you listen to before investing. But this belief you have in the 2020 election being stolen, it just doesn't match up with the way you typically go about collecting information, and having trouble connecting those two things. Appeal to their morality, something about them that they feel good about. Compliment them on that, highlight that for them, and then suddenly their ears will be open. All right, now I've just thrown a ton of strategies at you, so I want to give us some examples to kind of talk through. Let me see a couple chat messages here. I haven't had a chance to look at those. Okay. So here's our sort of slide deck of our trading cards of possible strategies. And here I have an encounter for you. So Easter's coming up and your uncle's coming over for breakfast, and his opening line when he opens the door is, hey, I hope you're happy with your Biden vote now that it costs more than $4 a gallon to fill up your car. Someone who kind of likes to egg you on. So in the chat, or if I don't know if folks can unmute, what might be a possible strategy that you could use when facing this opening line, or what's some way you could respond to this?
Folks should be able to unmute if they're so inclined.
Okay. I see something in the chat here. Kernel of truth. Finding the kernel of truth. Yeah, this is a great one for this one. Yeah, I am not happy about paying $4 a gallon of gas. It's really not a fun time. I've had to cut back on driving. I've had to cut back on other expenses. I am going to go ahead and disagree with you about the cause of that, but I am right there with you. $4 is no fun. All right, let's look at another one. Your cousin is stopping by your husband's birthday dinner, and their opening line is, why do we have to focus on race so much? Don't all lives matter? So where might we, attempt to come at this one? I know go home is tempting, and we would be right, but we might not be effective in that case. It's hard, right? It's really hard when these things hit so close to home and are so agitating and just awful. Um, so, there's a lot of ways you could go about this. You could find something like find the feeling. Yes, thank you, Karen. That's exactly what I was going to say. Find the feeling. Where is the anxiety about saying Black Lives Matter? What feels? Why does it feel so hard to say that? Why do we have to throw in the all lives matter? So instead of arguing against that claim, we can ask them about the feeling that they have there and try to understand that a little bit more. Okay, a school mom is going to be co-supervising a class field trip with you. I just worry about the kids learning about slavery in school this term, don't you? I mean, I know it was awful, but aren't kids too young to know about it? What do you think? This might be someone who isn't in a pre-contemplation stage, but might be a little bit more open to hearing things because they're opening the door. Appeal to their morality. I like that.
Could you do a compliment, like say that it's clear they really care about their kids and they're really thinking hard about how their kids are going to feel, and because they're a thoughtful parent?
Absolutely. Yeah. Wow, you sound like you care a lot about your kids' education. It's curious to me that you want to remove slavery. I see a couple offers here for playing Colombo. I love that. Appeal to morality. There's no wrong answer here. It's just a little practice to get us in that mental state. But everything everyone said here is wonderful, and obviously takes practice. So I do want to talk a little bit about when we don't use this. When would we want to avoid these strategies? Obviously, if you have concerns about your safety, if someone gets belligerent, if someone gets truly cruel when they're debating, it's probably not a great idea. When you have concerns about the safety of others, especially if there's someone in your home or at the table who is in a vulnerable population, who might risk hearing this person say some nasty things, then that might be a time where you just try not to bring the conversation up at all, or maybe you don't invite them over. But when there's concern about safety for you or the emotional safety of others, when you're already in it, like maybe you didn't make a game plan, or maybe you weren't expecting to see this person and emotions have already gotten high, it can be really hard to back out of it. And so kind of taking a little mental break can help. This word gets tossed around a lot, but if you expect the other person is a narcissist and they're just kind of in the conversation to feel good about themselves because they like making other people feel stupid or not good or whatever it is, then it might not be worth, engaging with that person. And finally, not so good to use on the internet. The internet is for trolls. So don't do it. Really, don't do it. I mean, really, don't engage online. Seriously, stay off the internet debating these folks. Okay, if you absolutely have to, couple pointers. Try to only engage with the people that you know, not with strangers. Many of the strangers out there saying terrible things online are doing it solely for the purpose of getting other people upset. Don't feed the trolls. A study on internet trolls found that they have high levels of narcissism, psychopathy, and sadism. These are not the kinds of people you want to ever have any conversation with. So try to stick with people you know. And if they're saying some awful things, consider private messaging them over a public comment. If you feel like it needs to be a public comment, don't respond in their thread, but start a new thread. So if someone's going off about all lives matter, instead of feeding into their conversation, start your own narrative, your own comment thread that doesn't necessarily even reference them, that's saying, one of the reasons I support Black Lives Matter is X, Y, and Z. If you do have to get into it in a discussion way, you could find the kernel of truth. That helps a lot on the internet. And stick to identifying emotions. All of the problems we talked about with debating gets magnified tenfold when people are anonymous behind their computer screen. So it's really best to stick with folks you know and try actually not to do it publicly. If you can, try to stick with it in private message. This is not an academic talk, so I don't have academic citations here. I'm happy to get them for you if you're interested, but I do have a list of things to explore more if you're curious about some of the things I talked about today. Logical fallacies, the internet trolls article, how, thinking about Superman can make people more liberal, just some fun articles here. But just to conclude, it's much more satisfying to say, please, you're not invited into my house anymore, shouting at somebody or just avoiding their conversation entirely. When we do that, we push them further to the right and we push their behavior onto more vulnerable populations who are going to have to deal with them and going to have to correct them when they're already emotionally overwhelmed. Let's be effective, not right. Let's not focus on what people deserve, but what we owe our communities using the power that we have. Let's set goals, avoid shame, choose our strategies, and most importantly, stay off the internet. Thanks, everyone. I'm happy to take some questions. I realize it's 3 o'clock.
I think we should absolutely allow questions. If folks need to jump off, they can do so. But I think we should all just take a moment to formally say thank you to Joan. My mind is sort of exploding in so many different ways, and I bet a lot of other people's are as well. So, let us, if she's willing, Joan, are you willing to stay on for a bit more if people have questions since we have you? So I have no end time per se, although I don't think we should do this till 7 o'clock at night, but if folks want to stay on and ask questions, we're happy to take it. I'm just going to give a gentle reminder that this is being recorded. So maybe if you have something really personal or something you want to talk about, maybe now is not the perfect time to do that because it is going to be recorded, but I think we can all continue to learn a lot from the ask and answer questions here. So if folks have questions, you should be able to unmute and go right ahead.
Joan, that was such a great presentation. I learned so much. Thank you. One question I had, you had your powerful and sort of humbling section about GMOs and Clinton's misconduct, areas where we can face the same hurdles to hearing the other side. When in a conversation might you start to realize that even there's more of a kernel of truth at the other side, that you may hold a very different view, but there is another valid perspective, and is there a way to help that person see your perspective while also acknowledging maybe there's that point of view you haven't thought of before? Are there sort of tools for that as well?
Yeah, I think that really nicely mirrors the kernel of truth element. And I know I threw my husband under the bus a few times here, but he is this miraculous person who can mid-argument say, yeah, you're right. I'm sorry, I'll stop. I don't know where he got that superpower, but if you are also one of those people and mid-debate go, that is a good point that I hadn't considered. And I do disagree with your premise overall, but I really would like to think about that more because you raise a good point. I think that's a great entry point. And it doesn't mean that you have given up your side of the conversation. You are meeting your goal of maybe having a next conversation or making them a little bit more open to hearing other points that you have. So it really does fit in well with that.
I'll toss a question in that I think might help a lot of people. I know I've struggled with it. Your point about not having these conversations when there's a more vulnerable person at the table with you who might be really harmed by having to hear it. How do you, the example I'm thinking of is especially in regards to members of the LGBTQ community who might not be out to everyone in their family, but might be out to a safe person that they know. And you have another relative who doesn't know that, who might truly be saying hurtful things. How do you deflect a conversation away from something you know is harming someone else without necessarily outing that person inadvertently. Could you give some good strategies there? And it doesn't have to be that prompt, but I could see that being true of a lot of things.
Well, I think a great place to start is talking with the vulnerable individual. You know, if cousin, you know, says the wrong thing is coming over, talk to your child, your niece, whoever, and say, you know, I know, you know, this isn't something you're comfortable telling the family about. I know this relative is not okay with this and is going to say some stuff. Here are some options for how we can deal with it. If the relative brings it up, I'm gonna just hold a no politics zone in the kitchen this year and say, you know, we've just decided that we're not going to talk about that. And I appreciate that you might disagree, but this is a decision I've made this year for everyone's mental health. So you could do that. If the person is coming by surprise or they're starting to say things that you didn't expect, you know, you have a couple options there. You could distract, you know, you could say, you know, you're really good with gardening. Can I show you these gardening boxes that I have that are just doing disastrous? Like, let's get you out of the house. So I would say in that strategy, like diffuse, deflect, and give, you know, the child or the vulnerable person, you know, time to maybe go to the bathroom, hide in their room, all of those techniques we use when we're trying to avoid people. But that's a great question. But a game plan, especially if you know someone's coming and you know they're probably going to be saying these not great things, talk it out with the person beforehand. All right, well, I'm also happy if folks have questions later or examples of relatives that, you know, they're concerned about to troubleshoot, or situations that, you know, I didn't get a chance to present here. Always happy to help out in the future.
Yeah.
Joan, would you be willing to, or is there some way to share the slides? Because I felt like at the end when you were giving the examples and we had to pick which one, my memory, I was not like, you know, some of them I was like, oh, I know Kernel of Truth. I know what that one is. But to just kind of go through them again with scenarios in mind, I think would be really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely happy to send out a slide deck to anyone who wants it, especially the ones like maybe a skills share deck.
Mm-hmm.
Happy to do that.
We can also put it on our link tree. The coalition has a link tree sort of page that allows us to upload content like that and sort of have things. I might also be able to upload the PDF entirely to correspond with the video. I think you can sometimes add files to that. So Jackie, I'll look into that and see if we can make technology work. So before we go, I want to give a couple amazing shout outs. The first, of course, is to Joan, Dr. DeGeorge, amazing work. She jumped off the call, but Melissa LaRoque is a member of our Adult Education and Action Committee. She did the graphic design work for the conversation series. So she's not here to hear me praise her, but I want to give her some credit for the design work and has been really an integral part of that, along with other members of the Adult Ed subcommittee who are here. I see Nancy's here, I see Kirsten from our board. You know, a lot of great people have put some energy into these conversations. So I also want to pitch a couple upcoming events the coalition is hosting. So we haven't set the date. We're looking for sometime in May, but the next speaker series is going to be with a social worker named Rory Mohammed Geller. Rory Geller Mohammed, sorry, from You Power Up. And she's going to be talking about how to raise anti-racist kids from sort of a social work perspective. So that's going to be our next conversation series. So look for that coming out soon. Also super important for the people who are local, the second annual Hamilton-Wenham Pride Picnic is going to be June 11th at the Patton Homestead again. We're working really hard on that event, and we're going to try to partner with other regional friends and allies to have another great event. So the Human Rights Coalition has a lot of great things in the works that we're really excited about. So this is just one part of what we do. If you haven't found us on social media, please do. We're at HW Human Rights pretty much everywhere, or online at hwhumanrights.org. So thanks so much for everyone tuning in. And thanks again, Joan, for spending this Saturday afternoon with us. This was really incredible. So thank you everyone for being here. And thank you, Joan, for being such a font of amazing information.
Thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of this rainy Saturday.
Okay.
Thank you, Joan. Thanks so much. Thank you, Anna.
It was great. Thank you.
Glad everyone loved it. Thanks for being here.